The pounding started at 11:17 that night. Not a knock. Not the careful tap of someone afraid they had the wrong house. It was the flat, furious slam of a fist against my front door, hard enough to rattle the framed photographs in the hallway. Callie appeared at the top of the stairs in bare feet, one hand gripping the banister, the other closed around the little brass orchard tag she had carried since she was 6. "Angela?" Before I could answer, Beverly Monroe's voice cut through the wood. "She's our blood. You have no right to keep her from us." For one strange second, I smelled funeral lilies. 11 years disappeared. I was back beside Tessa's casket, Callie's small fingers locked around mine, while Beverly looked at her own granddaughter as if she were an unpaid bill. "We don't want the burden," she had said. "You can keep her." Another blow struck the door. Craig shouted this time. "We know about the trust. Open the door before you make this worse." That afternoon, Naomi Bell had placed an appraisal on her desk and turned it toward us. $900,000. Not cash. Not yet. A quarter share of Monroe Orchards held in the trust Tessa had created for her daughter. Callie came down 3 steps, then stopped. "They didn't call on my birthday last year," she whispered. I moved toward the door, but she caught my sleeve. "What do they need me to sign?" The question landed harder than the pounding. I slid the security chain into place and opened the door 3 inches. Beverly stood on the porch in a cream coat, her face pale with anger. Craig was behind her, holding a leather folder against his chest. Beverly leaned toward the gap. "That woman is not your mother," she called past me. "Callie, you belong with your real family." I looked back at the girl I had raised through panic attacks, school meetings, therapy bills, nightmares, and 11 birthdays no Monroe had remembered. Then I looked at the family who had finally remembered her 6 weeks before she turned 18. "I'm not keeping her," I said. "Upstairs." Callie's fingers tightened around the brass tag. "She'll decide who gets to stay." 11 years earlier. Before I take you back to where this began, I hope you are doing well. Stay with me to hear what happened after that funeral, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of our story. 11 years earlier, Tessa and I were sitting on the kitchen floor with 6-year-old Callie between us. She had a fever, refused to swallow cherry medicine, and had wrapped herself in a bath towel because blankets made the room spin. Tessa pressed a cool cloth to her daughter's forehead. "If I ever get hit by a bus, you know she is yours." "You are not getting hit by a bus," I said, holding the medicine cup while Callie glared at both of us. "Fine. A falling piano." I told her she watched too many old cartoons. She smiled, but then her face changed. "I mean it, Angie. If anything happens to me, do not let her think nobody chose her." I promised because Tessa was young, stubborn and alive, and death still felt like something that happened in other people's houses. 4 years later, her cancer returned. Daniel, Callie's father, had died when she was 2. Tessa had raised her alone while still handling the orchard books from home. The second diagnosis came with words like aggressive and limited options. Tessa did not waste time pretending she had plenty of it. Callie was 6 when the treatment stopped working. She woke at night to check whether her mother was breathing. She stopped speaking to unfamiliar adults and panicked whenever anyone suggested sleeping away from home. Her therapist called it separation anxiety, complicated by anticipatory grief. Callie called it being careful. I drove her to therapy every Tuesday because Tessa was often too weak after treatment. I picked her up from school, made plain noodles when she could not eat, and sat beside her in hospital waiting rooms while she counted ceiling tiles. I did not think of myself as her mother. I was simply the person who kept showing up. Tessa's family showed up differently. Beverly came to the hospital in a wool coat too elegant for the plastic chair beside the bed. Craig arrived late, smelling of cold air and engine oil. Tessa asked them what would happen to Callie if she died. Beverly folded her gloves into her purse. "You are talking as if this is already decided." "It is decided," Tessa said. "I need to know who will take her." Craig talked about harvest season, payroll, and Beverly's lack of space. Beverly mentioned therapy costs, Callie's trouble sleeping, and how difficult it would be for a child that anxious to adjust. She needs more than we can give, Craig finally said. Tessa looked at him. She needs someone to stay. Neither answered. The next week, Naomi Bell came to the hospital with a narrow black folder. She explained that Tessa could nominate me as Callie's guardian, but the court would still have to approve it. Tessa signed slowly, stopping when her hand cramped. I signed where Naomi pointed, though my fingers shook worse than hers. When Naomi stepped outside, I told Tessa I was scared. "So am I," she said. "That is why I'm asking you. I have never raised a child. You have been helping me raise this one for years." The truth frightened me more than the paperwork. A few days later, Tessa asked me to bring Callie to the hospital. From the drawer beside her bed, she took out a small brass tag, dulled by age. A number had been stamped into it beside the name Monroe Orchards. "This marks the row where I planted your tree," she told Callie. "The spring you were born." Callie rubbed her thumb across the numbers. "Is it still there?" "It was the last time I checked." "Will it die if you do?" Tessa closed her eyes for a moment. "Not if someone keeps caring for it." Callie put the tag in her pocket. She carried it every day after that. Tessa died 3 weeks later. At the funeral, Callie stood pressed against my side in a dark blue dress, her fingers locked around mine and the brass tag hidden in her other fist. People bent toward her, telling her how brave she was. She stared at their shoes. Near the casket, Beverly and Craig spoke quietly with Naomi. I heard my name, then guardianship, then Callie's therapy schedule. Beverly glanced toward us with the same expression she had worn while discussing hospital bills. When I approached, she did not lower her voice. "We don't want the burden," she said, pointing toward the child holding my hand. "You can keep her." Craig looked down at the carpet. His silence was the second rejection. I wanted to tell Beverly what kind of woman says such a thing beside her daughter's coffin, but Callie's hand had gone rigid in mine, and this was no longer about winning an argument. I knelt until my face was level with hers. "We are going home," I said. She did not ask whose home I meant. She just let me lead her away. That evening, after the last neighbor left, Callie sat on the edge of my guest bed with her shoes still on. A small backpack rested beside her, packed with 2 shirts, her toothbrush and the brass tag. "Where are you going?" I asked. She stared at the floor. "I thought you might take me somewhere tomorrow." "Why would I do that?" "Because Grandma said you could keep me." Her voice dropped. "People return things they do not want." I sat beside her, careful not to touch her, until she leaned toward me. "No one is returning you," I said. "I'm staying." She looked at me as if staying were a language she had heard, but never trusted. 2 days later, Naomi met me at the courthouse. Beverly and Craig had signed papers stating that they would not oppose my guardianship petition. Naomi explained the hearing and the home visit. Before we left, she placed a sealed file inside her office safe. Tessa left instructions for the day. "Callie is old enough to ask her own questions," she said. Through the open doorway, I could see Callie asleep in a waiting room chair, her backpack under her head and one hand closed around the brass tag. I thought the hardest question had already been answered. I had no idea it would take 11 years for the real one to be asked. For the first 3 weeks after Tessa died, Callie packed her backpack every night. She did it after brushing her teeth, when she thought I was downstairs. 2 shirts, 1 pair of socks, her toothbrush and the brass orchard tag went into the same faded blue bag. Then she placed it beside the guest room door and slept with her shoes within reach. The first time I noticed, I unpacked everything before morning. The next night, she packed it again. On the 4th night, I sat on the floor beside the bag, instead of touching it. Callie watched me from the bed with her knees against her chest. "Where do you think you're going?" I asked. "I don't know where you picked." "I didn't pick anywhere. Grandma said you could keep me." Her fingers tightened around the blanket. "That means you can give me to somebody else." I wanted to promise that nothing would ever change again, But too much had already changed for that to sound honest. Your cereal is in my kitchen. Your medicine is in my bathroom. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to therapy, and afterward we're coming back here. She glanced at the backpack. For how long? As long as you need me. The next morning, the bag was still packed, but she left it beside the bed when we drove away. That was the beginning of our life together. Not a grand declaration, just one small bag that stayed behind. Therapy was 40 minutes away every Tuesday. Before the guardianship was finalized, insurance covered almost nothing. Afterward, there were still co-payments, school consultations, and appointments outside the network. I learned which bills could wait, and which clients would forgive a delayed delivery. Some weeks, Callie sat through the whole session without speaking. I never asked what she had told the therapist. I only asked whether she wanted music or silence on the drive home. One afternoon, she said, "Silence, but not the kind where you're mad." So I drove quietly and hummed under my breath, just enough for her to know I was still there. The first time the school called about a panic attack, I was stripping varnish from a walnut dresser. I found Callie crouched beside the nurse's filing cabinet, breathing too quickly to answer questions. The nurse looked relieved. "Maybe you can calm her down." I could not calm her down. Therapy had taught me that. I could only sit on the floor, place my hand where she could see it, and breathe slowly enough for her to borrow the rhythm. In for 4, hold for 2, out for 6. 17 minutes later, she could stand. I asked whether she wanted to go home. "If I leave, everyone will know." "They already know you had a hard morning. That is not the same as knowing who you are." She finished the school day. I waited in the parking lot because she had asked me not to leave. When she came outside, she climbed into the truck without checking whether her backpack was still packed. By 4th grade, the panic attacks came less often. The fear beneath them stayed. That spring, her class was assigned a family tree project. Tessa belonged beneath the word mother. Daniel belonged beside her, though Callie remembered almost nothing about him. Beverly and Craig had obvious places too, whether they had earned them or not. Callie tapped an empty branch. "Where do I put you?" "Wherever you think I belong. There isn't a box for you." I placed a blank sheet beside the worksheet. "Then make one. Would that erase Mom?" "No. Loving me does not take anything away from her." She drew another branch beside Tessa's. The teacher gave her a B for not following the template. I framed it anyway. The Monroes did not attend that presentation. They were absent from her 10th birthday, her middle school graduation, and the Christmas when a stomach virus sent us to urgent care because Callie mistook dehydration for another panic attack. Beverly mailed one unsigned card during those years. I stopped expecting them before Callie did. Near every birthday, she still looked at the phone when it rang. At graduation, she claimed she had not wanted them there, then folded the program until the paper split along the creases. I built my restoration shop during those same years. At first, I worked from the garage, while Callie did homework at a folding table beside me. Later, I rented a narrow storefront with enough room for 3 workbenches. Callie liked sanding because it gave her hands something predictable to do. She learned that rushing left marks and that damage did not disappear simply because the surface looked smooth again. When she was 14, she opened an insurance statement showing what therapy had cost that year. "I'm sorry about this," she said. "For reading my mail? For costing this much." She pointed at the total. "I can go less. You need the appointments you need. You would have more money if I wasn't here. Care is not a debt, Callie. You do not owe me for growing up." She nodded, but gratitude had already become one of the ways she made herself small. She apologized before asking for rides and chose the cheapest item on every menu. I told myself I was teaching her security. I did not notice how often I rewarded her for being easy. By 17, Callie worked 2 afternoons a week at the public library and was preparing an application to Briar Glen Community College. She had better tools for anxiety, but pressure still slowed her down. She needed time before answering difficult questions. She had also begun worrying about leaving me. One evening, I found the college application open on her laptop. The section asking whether she planned to live at home was blank. "What would you do if I moved someday?" she asked. I almost told her I would be fine. Instead, I said, "You are not moving yet." It was not an answer. It was a way of ending the question. That habit had grown quietly. At school meetings, I explained what Callie needed before she spoke. At medical appointments, I answered when doctors asked about her symptoms. When a counselor mentioned an overnight college orientation, I said Callie did not like sleeping away from home. Sometimes she corrected me. More often, she let me speak because she loved me and did not want to sound ungrateful. I mistook her silence for agreement, because agreement was less frightening than the possibility that she no longer needed me to know everything first. 6 weeks before her 18th birthday, Callie carried the old wooden memory box into the kitchen. The brass orchard tag lay across her palm. "I want to know about Mom's tree," she said. "What about it? Is it still at the orchard?" "I assume so. You have never taken me there." I told her the Monroes had never invited us, and that I had not wanted to expose her to people who had already shown what they thought of her. "That is not the same as asking what I wanted. You were a child. I'm not 6 anymore." She opened the box herself. Inside were photographs, Tessa's hospital bracelet, 2 birthday cards in her handwriting, and a faded picture of apple trees under a white spring sky. Callie lifted each item carefully, learning a mother I had preserved in pieces. I told her how Tessa laughed when nervous, and how she never followed a recipe without changing it. Whenever Callie asked about Beverly or Craig, I redirected her toward Tessa. Callie noticed every evasion. Before she could ask again, my phone rang. Naomi Bell's name appeared on the screen. I had spoken to Naomi occasionally about guardianship reports and routine trust notices. I knew Tessa's will had placed a small ownership interest in Monroe Orchards into a trust for Callie. The reports described it as illiquid, with no reliable market value and little distributable income. It had never paid our bills, and I had never expected it to. Naomi asked whether Callie was with me. "Callie is right beside me. I need both of you in my office tomorrow," she said. "An offer has been made on the orchard, and it triggered a formal appraisal." Callie watched my face. I asked what the appraisal changed. There was a pause long enough for me to hear paper shifting on Naomi's desk. "The preliminary valuation came back at approximately $900,000, she said, "and the Monroes already know." Naomi's office had not changed much in 11 years. The same brass lamp stood beside the window, and the same wooden clock clicked above the filing cabinet. What had changed was the girl sitting beside me. Callie held the brass orchard tag beneath the table, turning it between her fingers while Naomi arranged 3 folders in front of us. She had not spoken since we left home. Naomi looked at her rather than at me. "Before we discuss numbers, I want you to understand who I represent. The trustee has separate counsel. Monroe Orchards has its own lawyer. I am here for you, Callie, so you can understand what you are being asked to consider." Callie nodded once. "Angela can stay? If you want her here?" Callie glanced at me, then back at Naomi. "I want her here. I just want people to answer me." The words were not sharp, but I felt them. I folded my hands in my lap so I would not reach for hers. Naomi opened the first folder. She explained that Tessa's will had created a trust for Callie. I already knew that much. For years, I had received brief annual notices describing the trust's main asset as a non-liquid ownership interest with no reliable market value and almost no income available for Callie's daily expenses. The asset was 25% of Monroe Orchards, LLC. It was never a bank account with $900,000 sitting inside it, Naomi said. The trust owns part of the company that owns the land, equipment, and operating business. Callie stopped turning the tag. "Then where did the number come from?" Naomi slid the appraisal across the desk. A development company had offered to purchase the entire property. The offer triggered a formal valuation of every ownership share. After debts, taxes, and estimated closing costs, The trust's 25% interest was valued at approximately $900,000. Callie stared at the number without smiling. I had imagined shock, disbelief, or even a nervous laugh. Instead, her face tightened. If Mom had something worth that much, why were you paying for? She asked me. Why did you sell your truck when the roof needed replacing? I opened my mouth, but Naomi answered first. Because value is not the same as cash. The trust owned part of an operating orchard. It could not sell a few trees whenever you needed a medical copayment. Your mother designed it to protect something for your future, not to create spending money while you were a child. Callie looked down at the appraisal again. So I'm worth $900,000, only if they sell the place where she grew up. No, Naomi said gently. You are not worth anything in dollars. An asset held for you has been valued. Those are not the same thing. Callie's shoulders lowered slightly, but the tag remained trapped inside her fist. Naomi turned to the second folder. The operating agreement for Monroe Orchards required unanimous approval before the entire property could be sold. The trustee held and voted the 25% interest inside Callie's trust, but Tessa had added another protection. After Callie turned 18, the trustee could not proceed with a full sale unless Callie first received independent legal advice and signed an informed beneficiary consent. Her consent would allow the trustee to consider supporting the sale. It would not force the trustee to approve it. So, I don't control the trust, Callie said. Not by yourself, Naomi replied. The trustee holds the asset and must conduct an independent fiduciary review. But the trustee also cannot treat you like a name on a file. Tessa made sure your informed consent mattered in a sale this large. What if I refuse? The current sale cannot move forward under these terms. I leaned toward Naomi. Then she refuses. Callie turned her head. The room became so quiet that I could hear the wooden clock above the filing cabinet. Naomi did not look at me. That decision belongs to Callie after she has received the information she needs. The trustee's final fiduciary decision belongs to the trustee. I am not letting them pressure her. That is not the same as deciding for her, Naomi said. Callie placed the brass tag on the desk. Why does everything change when I turn 18? Because that is when the additional consent provision becomes active. Your mother wanted you to be old enough to receive independent advice before anyone asked you to approve the sale of the entire orchard. Callie's gaze moved between us. Did Dad have anything to do with this? Naomi shook her head. Daniel Reed's estate had gone through probate after he died, when Callie was 2. Nothing from his family was included in the Monroe Trust, and no one on the Reed side had any ownership, guardianship, or claim involving the orchard. This comes entirely through Tessa, Naomi said. No one from your father's family can intervene in this transaction. Callie absorbed that in silence. The question had probably lived inside her longer than I knew. Naomi closed the first 2 folders, but left the third untouched. Craig Monroe contacted the trustee after the appraisal. He also asked to meet with you. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. No. Callie looked at me again. Naomi's expression remained calm. I have not arranged anything. I wanted Callie to understand the structure before she heard anyone's version of what it means. They had 11 years to meet with her, I said. They do not get to arrive now because the land is valuable. Callie pressed her thumb against the edge of the brass tag. What did Craig say? He said the orchard has substantial debt, and the sale may be necessary to protect the family and its employees. He said family, Callie murmured. Naomi waited. Callie looked at me. Can they take me away from you? The question brought back the packed backpack beside the guest room door. It took effort not to answer immediately. Naomi leaned closer. They cannot simply appear and claim you because they are related to you. You are 17. Angela has been your legal guardian for 11 years, and your wishes would matter greatly in any proceeding. They can threaten, pressure, and create fear. That is different from having the legal power to remove you. I do not want them contacting her, I said. Everything goes through me. Callie's face changed. It was not anger yet. It was recognition. Naomi spoke carefully. Until Callie turns 18, you remain her guardian. You can protect her from harassment. But legal protection should not prevent her from receiving information about her own property or deciding whether she wants a structured conversation. I know what they are doing. Callie picked up the tag. You know what they did 11 years ago. None of us knows exactly what they are doing now. The sentence frightened me because it was true. On the drive home, Callie watched the orchards pass outside the window. Rows of trees stretched behind fences, green and orderly from the road, hiding whatever damage might exist deeper inside. Why did they find out so quickly? She asked. The company making the offer probably contacted every member. They did not call when I graduated middle school. I know. They did not call when I was sick. I know that too. But someone tells them my share is worth money, and Craig contacts a lawyer before I even hear about it. I tightened my hands around the steering wheel. That tells you something. It tells me they need something, she said. It does not tell me what they will say to get it. I wanted to tell her none of their words mattered. I wanted to close every door before they could reach her. Instead, I drove us home with Naomi's warning sitting between us. At 11:17 that night, the first blow struck the front door. Callie appeared at the top of the stairs while I crossed the hallway. Beverly's voice came through the wood before I reached it. She's our blood. You have no right to keep her from us. The sentence pulled the smell of funeral lilies back into my throat. Craig shouted next. We only want to save Tessa's orchard. Open the door. I fastened the security chain and opened the door a few inches. Beverly stood beneath the porch light in a cream coat. Craig held a leather folder against his chest. You need to leave, I said. Beverly tried to look past me. Callie, sweetheart, we have made mistakes. You belong with your real family. Callie had come halfway down the stairs. She did not move closer. What do you need me to sign? She asked. Craig's eyes shifted toward Beverly. He had prepared documents, arguments, and probably an entire speech, but he had not prepared for Callie to begin with the only question that mattered. This is bigger than a signature, he said. The orchard has supported our family and dozens of workers for generations. That did not answer her, I said. Craig lifted the folder. The purchase offer expires shortly after her birthday. If she cooperates, the debts can be paid and the property can be transferred cleanly. Callie stepped down one more stair. And if I do not? Craig looked directly at her for the first time. Without your signature, the sale dies. And if the sale dies, the orchard may die with it. Callie closed her hand around the brass tag. For 11 years, it had been proof that her mother had planted something for her. That night, it began to feel like a responsibility everyone expected her to carry. Without her signature, the sale dies, Craig repeated. And if the sale dies, the orchard may die with it. You need to leave my property, I said. Beverly opened her mouth, but I kept my hand on the door and looked directly at Craig. You came here after 11 at night, frightened a 17-year-old girl, and brought papers she has not reviewed with her lawyer. Leave now or I will call the police and ask them to remove you. Craig's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he might test me. Then Beverly touched his arm. Not like this, she whispered. Her anger disappeared so quickly that I almost trusted it. Her shoulders dropped, and when she looked past me toward Callie, her face seemed older than it had beneath the funeral home lights. We made a terrible mistake, she said. I know what I said after your mother died. I have heard it in my head every day since. Callie had reached the bottom step but stayed inside the hallway. Then why didn't you call? Beverly flinched. Because shame gets heavier the longer you carry it. After a while, I did not know how to come back. That did not stop you tonight, I said. Craig gave me a warning look. But Beverly continued speaking to Callie. Your mother used to stand barefoot in the kitchen when she baked, she said. Even in winter. She said shoes made it harder to think. Callie's expression changed. Tessa had done that in my kitchen too, She would kick off her shoes before opening a cookbook, then ignore half the instructions and leave flour across the floor. I had never told Callie that detail. Beverly saw that she had reached her. "I have photographs," she said. "Recipes in her handwriting. Things that belong to you." Craig placed a hand beneath her elbow and guided her away from the porch. Before leaving, he raised the leather folder. "I will send the financial summary to Naomi tomorrow. The debt is real. Whatever you think of us, people will lose their jobs if this goes wrong." Callie watched them walk to the car. She did not ask me to close the door until their headlights disappeared. The next morning, Naomi forwarded the summary Craig had promised. I expected inflated numbers and vague threats. Instead, the documents showed equipment loans, a weak harvest, rising labor costs, and a line of credit secured against part of the property. The orchard was not collapsing that afternoon, but Craig had not invented the danger. I closed the file. "It changes nothing." Callie sat across from me at the kitchen table. "It changes whether he was lying. He came to our house in the middle of the night. I know what he did. Then there is no reason to meet him." She studied me for several seconds. "Do you have the right to decide that? I am still your legal guardian." "That is not what I asked." The question made my chest tighten. For 11 years, I had been the person who decided which therapist to call, which school meetings required a lawyer, and which relatives could be allowed near her. Every one of those choices had seemed necessary at the time. Callie rested her palms on the table. "Naomi said I should understand what they want before I decide anything. They want your consent. Maybe. But Grandma also knew something about Mom that I didn't. That does not make her safe." "No, but it makes her someone who knew my mother before either of us did." I wanted to say that Beverly had forfeited the right to share those memories when she called Callie a burden. The words would have been satisfying, but they would not have answered what Callie was asking. I called Naomi. We agreed to a lunch at a quiet restaurant near her office. Naomi would attend, no documents would be signed, and the conversation would end if Beverly or Craig pressured Callie. I gave Callie the rules as we drove there. "You do not have to answer anything. You do not have to promise another meeting. If you want to leave, squeeze my hand. I can say I want to leave." "I know." "Then let me say it." I nodded, though every part of me wanted a private signal only I could recognize. Beverly arrived, carrying a flat archival box. Craig brought another folder but left it closed beside his chair after Naomi reminded him that lunch was not a business meeting. For the first few minutes, no one knew what to say. Then Beverly opened the box. The first photograph showed Tessa at 8 years old, missing a front tooth and sitting on the hood of an old pickup. The next showed her in a high school softball uniform. In another, she stood beneath rows of white apple blossoms, with her hands raised as if she were catching snow. Callie touched the edge of that picture. "I smile like that. You have her eyes too," Beverly said. "Everyone told her they were too serious when she was young." Callie looked at me, then back at the photograph. There were parts of Tessa I had known intimately, but I had not known the child in those images. For the first time, Callie was looking at a history I could not narrate for her. Beverly removed a yellowed recipe card. "Your mother changed my apple butter recipe when she was 16, added orange peel, and refused to admit it tasted better." Callie smiled despite herself. "I should have come sooner," Beverly said. "We were grieving. Craig was trying to keep the orchard running, and I could barely walk into Tessa's room without falling apart." The apology sounded sincere until it reached the excuse. Callie heard it too. "I was grieving." Beverly lowered her eyes. "Yes, you were." Craig shifted the conversation toward the orchard. He described the irrigation repairs, equipment debt, and families who depended on seasonal work. He spoke without exaggeration, which made his argument more difficult to dismiss. "If the sale closes," he said, "the loans are paid, the workers receive what they are owed, and no one loses everything in foreclosure. This is not about taking Callie's trust. Her share remains protected." Naomi folded her hands. "The trustee has not completed its independent review. I understand. Craig looked at Callie. Have you been allowed to speak with the trustee alone? It was the first personal question he had asked her. Not where she went to school. Not what she planned after graduation. Not whether she still had panic attacks or remembered his sister's voice. Callie noticed. I have spoken with my lawyer, she said. Craig glanced at Naomi. The trustee will need to know Callie understands the consequences. So will Callie, Naomi replied. Beverly reached into the box again and produced a photograph of a thin apple sapling tied to a wooden stake. Tessa stood beside it holding a bundled infant. This was taken the day we planted your tree, Beverly said. April 26th, 3 days after you came home from the hospital. Callie looked at the brass tag hanging from a cord inside her shirt. Beverly smiled sadly. 6 weeks from Tuesday, you will be 18. I would like to show you the tree before then. The precision of the date hung over the table. Callie's 17th birthday had passed without a card or telephone call. Beverly had missed 11 Christmases and every school milestone, yet she knew exactly how many weeks remained before the trust provision changed. You can visit the orchard, Beverly continued. You should see where your mother grew up before anyone asks you to decide its future. Callie isn't ready for that, I said. All 4 of them looked at me. Callie's face became still. You did it again. I am trying to keep this from moving too quickly. Craig says I do not understand the business. Grandma says I need my real family. You say I am not ready. Everyone has a different reason, but all of you keep deciding what I can handle. That is not fair. No, she said quietly. It isn't. Lunch ended soon afterward. Beverly asked Callie to keep the photographs, but Callie accepted only copies. Craig did not open his folder. That restraint worried me more than another argument would have. In the car, I told Callie that the meeting had proved my concerns. Craig had asked about the trustee before asking about her life. Beverly remembered the date her consent would matter, but not the birthdays when Callie had needed her. I saw all of that, Callie said. Then you understand why the orchard visit is a bad idea. I also saw my mother's handwriting. I saw what she looked like at my age. Why do you keep acting like anything they give me automatically belongs to their plan? Because they are using those things to reach you. And you are using what they did 11 years ago to stop me from finding out anything new. She turned toward the window and did not speak again. 2 days later, an envelope arrived addressed to Callie in Beverly's careful handwriting. I stood in the kitchen with it for several minutes. I knew the correct thing was to place it beside Callie's breakfast plate and let her decide whether to open it. Instead, I imagined Beverly's voice entering our house again. I imagined Callie agreeing to visit the orchard before Naomi could prepare her. I imagined losing 11 years of trust to a woman who had brought photographs to one lunch. I opened the drawer where I kept insurance forms and college documents. Then I placed the sealed envelope beneath them. I told myself I would give it to Callie after she had spoken to her therapist. I told myself waiting was not the same as hiding. That evening, Callie found me standing at the kitchen counter, counting the remaining weeks on the calendar, without realizing I was doing it. Why does everyone keep counting down to my birthday? She asked. I looked at her and said nothing. Behind me, inside the closed drawer, Beverly's unopened letter waited with Callie's name written across the front. 2 weeks after our first meeting with Naomi, with exactly 4 weeks left before Callie's 18th birthday, I drove her to Monroe Orchards. The visit had not been Beverly's decision or mine. Callie had discussed it with her therapist, then asked Naomi to arrange clear conditions. We would stay for 2 hours. No documents would be signed. Craig could explain the business, but any financial records he mentioned had to be sent to Naomi afterward. I agreed because refusing would have proved the very thing Callie had accused me of doing. The orchard appeared beyond a low ridge, rows of tired green trees stretching toward a weathered packing house. Late summer sunlight rested on the leaves, but the ground beneath them was dry and powdery. The air smelled of warm apples, dust and old wood. Somewhere behind the building, Empty crates struck against one another with slow, hollow knocks. The place was beautiful, but it was not healthy. Several rows had missing trees. An irrigation pipe lay exposed beside a trench, patched in 3 places. One tractor had no rear tire. Craig had not invented the orchard's problems for our benefit. Beverly waited near the farmhouse. She did not try to hug Callie. For once, she seemed to understand that reaching too quickly might make Callie step back. "I thought we could begin inside," she said. "Your mother's room is still almost the way she left it." Callie touched the brass tag beneath her shirt. "You kept it for 11 years? I kept it for longer than that." The farmhouse smelled of cinnamon, furniture polish, and the faint dampness of an old building. Family photographs covered the hallway. Tessa appeared everywhere, as a child with scraped knees, a teenager in a softball uniform, a young woman holding a tray of misshapen pies. Callie slowed in front of each picture. In one photograph, Tessa stood with her head tilted slightly when she smiled. Callie did the same thing whenever she was trying not to laugh. In another, Tessa sat cross-legged on a porch step, twisting a loose thread around one finger. Callie looked down and realized she was doing exactly that with the hem of her shirt. For most of her life, resemblance had been something other people mentioned and I could not prove. Inside that hallway, it became visible. Beverly opened a narrow bedroom at the end of the 2nd floor. Faded stars had been painted across the ceiling. Marks climbed one side of the doorframe, each labeled with Tessa's age. Callie placed her fingers beside the line marked 17. "She was shorter than me." "She hated that," Beverly said. "Craig used to place things on the highest shelf just to make her ask for help." A small wooden horse stood on the dresser. Callie picked it up carefully. "She carved that in shop class," Beverly continued. "Cut her thumb so badly the teacher called me at work. She refused stitches because Craig told her they would sew her whole hand shut." Callie smiled. It was not the polite smile she used when adults shared memories she felt expected to appreciate. This one arrived before she could control it. I felt relieved, then ashamed of the relief. For 11 years, I had tried to keep Tessa present through stories and photographs, but I had known only the woman she became. Beverly knew the child Callie had never been allowed to meet. Callie opened the closet. A denim jacket hung at the back with Tessa's initials written inside the collar. "Can I try it?" Beverly nodded. The sleeves were slightly short, but the jacket settled across Callie's shoulders as if it had been waiting for her. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for a moment I saw both of them. "This feels strange," she said. "Bad strange?" I asked. Callie shook her head. "Like I recognized something I never saw before." Beverly's eyes filled, but she turned away before the tears fell. Her grief was real. That was what made her harder to dismiss. When we stepped outside again, Beverly noticed the cord around Callie's neck. "Is that the orchard tag?" Callie lifted it into the sunlight. Beverly read the stamped number and led us past the packing house toward the western rows. The ground grew rougher beneath our feet. Fallen apples softened in the dust, sweet and slightly fermented. We stopped beside an old tree whose trunk had split low and healed around the wound. A small metal marker remained near its roots, bearing the same number as Callie's tag. "Your mother planted this 3 days after you came home from the hospital," Beverly said. "Craig dug the hole. Tessa said he made it too shallow and redid the entire thing after he left." Callie pressed her palm to the bark. "It looks damaged." "It survived a freeze 6 years ago," Beverly replied. "We thought we would lose it." Callie looked up through the branches. A few red apples hung above her. "It stayed," she whispered. "Craig joined us there. He had changed from the pressed shirt he wore at lunch into work clothes stained with soil. The choice might have been deliberate, but the exhaustion in his face was not. He walked us through the oldest section of the orchard and explained how the property had passed through 4 generations. He showed us the broken irrigation line, the equipment shed, and a field that had produced almost nothing that year. "The sale would clear the loans," he said. "The workers would be paid, and every ownership share would receive its proper value. Everyone gets the chance to begin again, without waiting for the bank to decide for us. Callie looked across the rows. Does all of it have to be sold? Craig did not answer immediately. Could you sell part of the land? She continued. Or lease something, or keep the trees that still produce. We have studied every realistic option. That is not the same as no. His expression tightened. The business is complicated, Callie. Selling portions would create tax, access, and water right problems. The adults managing this place have spent years trying to solve it. Naomi had warned us to notice answers that sounded complete without providing evidence. Then send her the records that prove it, I said. I intend to. An older man approached, carrying a wooden crate. Craig introduced him as Walter Ruiz, who had worked at the orchard since before Tessa left for college. Walter removed his cap when he saw Callie. I remember your mother carrying you through these rows, he said. Thank you for coming. A lot of families depend on what happens here. Callie's face changed beneath the weight of his gratitude. She had entered the orchard, believing the decision concerned property, debt, and people who had abandoned her. Walter gave those numbers faces. I haven't decided anything, she said. I know, he replied. I'm only glad you came to see it. After he left, Craig watched her carefully. You deserve to know this place sooner, he said. Angela should have brought you. She was protecting me, Callie answered, though the words lacked certainty. From the orchard? From you. Craig accepted that without defending himself. Maybe we earned that. But protection can become a locked door if only one person holds the key. I stepped between them before I realized I had moved. Do not turn my guardianship into part of your sales pitch. I asked Callie a question. No, you planted an accusation. Craig looked around me. What do you want, Callie? She wants the full records before anyone asks her to make a decision. Callie closed her eyes briefly. Craig noticed. So did Beverly. I asked her, he said. I am not letting you corner her. I can answer, Callie said. You do not have to. Her voice sharpened. That is still an answer you chose for me. Craig folded his arms. You see why we worry that she has heard only one side. And you see why I do not trust you, I replied. Callie pulled Tessa's jacket tighter around herself. Both of you keep saying you are protecting me. One of you wants me to sign, and the other keeps telling me what I want before I speak. I stopped arguing. Callie faced Craig. Send Naomi everything. The debts, the offer, the operating agreement, and every alternative you considered. Craig gave a slow nod. Some of those records are difficult to understand. Then, I will take the time to understand them. On the drive home, Callie watched the trees disappear behind us. I believe the visit had exposed what Craig was doing. He had used workers, family history, and Tessa's memory to make a business decision feel like a moral obligation. Callie had seen something else too. At home, she went upstairs without speaking. I stayed in the kitchen, replaying every moment when I should have remained silent, and every moment Craig had used my fear against me. 10 minutes later, I heard a drawer close. Callie returned carrying her birth certificate, her community college forms, and the sealed envelope Beverly had mailed. She placed the letter on the table between us. When did this come? There was no answer that could protect me from what I had done. Before the orchard visit, I said. You knew it was addressed to me. Yes. Did Naomi tell you to hide it? No. Did my therapist? No. Callie looked at the unopened envelope, then at me. Her face held none of the panic I had spent 11 years learning to manage. What I saw was quieter and worse. You don't protect me, she said. You edit my life. You edit my life. Callie's words stayed between us while the late afternoon light moved across the kitchen table. The sealed envelope lay beside her birth certificate and college forms, her name written across it in Beverly's careful handwriting. I wanted to tell her I had only planned to keep it for a few days. I wanted to remind her that Beverly had abandoned her, that Craig needed her consent, and that every instinct I had was trying to keep her from being used. Instead, I said, I hid it because I was afraid she would hurt you again. Callie's eyes remained on the envelope. So you decided I didn't need to know it existed? Yes. How many other things have you decided I didn't need to know? The question was harder because I did not have a number. I had declined invitations before mentioning them. I had answered questions at appointments because Callie took too long, and people grew impatient. I had told teachers she would not attend overnight trips before asking whether she wanted to try. Each choice had begun as protection. Over time, I had stopped noticing when protection became permission I gave myself. I don't know, I admitted. More than I should have. Callie looked up then. Anger would have been easier. What I saw was disappointment, the quiet kind that rearranges a relationship without raising its voice. Did you know about the $900,000? I knew the trust existed. I knew it owned part of the orchard. The report said the interest was illiquid and had no reliable market value. I did not know what it was worth until Naomi called us. You never saw a different number? No. She searched my face, then turned to the folder Naomi had given us. The old trust notices were inside, each one describing the same ownership interest and the lack of distributable income. Naomi had explained the valuation in front of both of us. Callie believed me, but belief did not repair what I had done. She opened Beverly's envelope. The first page was an apology. Beverly wrote that grief had made her cold and cowardly, that she had repeated the sentence from the funeral in her mind for 11 years and hated herself each time. She did not write that she had forgotten Callie. She wrote that shame had made every year of silence harder to cross. 3 photographs slid onto the table. One showed Tessa asleep on a couch with infant Callie against her chest. Another showed the orchard in bloom. The third was a close-up of Tessa's hand holding the same brass tag Callie now wore around her neck. The final page invited Callie back to the orchard. Beverly offered to show her family albums, Tessa's school notebooks, and the place where Daniel had proposed. She did not mention the sale, the trust, or the consent Craig needed. That omission made the letter more difficult to judge. If she had asked me to sign something, I would know what this was, Callie said. She knows better than to put that in writing. Or maybe she wants to know me. Both can be true. Callie folded the letter along its original crease. I need to talk to her without you answering for me. Fear rose so quickly that I nearly refused before she finished speaking. She will use your mother against you. Then I need to hear it happen. You don't have to prove anything by letting her hurt you, and you don't get to protect me by controlling every conversation. I pressed both hands against the edge of the table. Naomi has to arrange it. Or Dr. Patel can help you set boundaries first. No private car rides, no papers, and no conversation about the sale without your lawyer. Callie considered the conditions. That's fair. The fact that she called them fair, rather than accusing me of another locked door, told me she was not trying to escape me. She was trying to have room inside the life we shared. She took the envelope upstairs and closed her bedroom door. She did not pack a bag or threaten to leave. Somehow, the quiet click of the latch frightened me more than the faded blue backpack ever had. I slept badly and went to the workshop early the next morning. Craig arrived before I had finished unlocking the rear door. He wore a clean work shirt and carried a slim document case. He did not ask whether Callie had read Beverly's letter. I thought we should speak without an audience, he said. I am not discussing Callie without her lawyer. This is about you. That should have made me send him away. Instead, I let him stand near the front workbench while I kept the door open behind him. Craig placed a 4-page agreement on the scarred wood between us. He described it as reimbursement, not payment. Once the orchard sale closed, the Monroe family would compensate me for a portion of Callie's therapy, educational support, and other care expenses from the past 11 years. The amount was large enough to clear my business loan and replace every piece of equipment I had repaired twice. What do you want in return? I asked. Nothing unreasonable. You acknowledge publicly that the sale serves Callie's best interests. You encourage her to give informed consent once she turns 18. You stop portraying us as strangers trying to steal from her. You are strangers to her. We are her family. You remembered that when you needed unanimous approval. His mouth tightened, but his voice stayed controlled. You carried expenses that should never have been yours alone. This makes that right. Care is not a debt. Everything costs something, Angela. Therapy cost money. School cost money. Your time cost money. Pretending otherwise does not make you noble. I pushed the agreement back toward him. I did not raise her on credit. Craig did not pick it up. You should think before refusing. The orchard is not the only thing you could lose. I stared at him. Is that a threat? It is an observation. Callie is almost 18. She wants answers you cannot give her. She wants a connection to her mother you cannot provide. You keep insisting this is about protecting her, but I think you are terrified she will meet us and realize she no longer needs you. The words found the part of me I had spent 11 years refusing to name. I had imagined Callie going to college, building a life and becoming independent. I had encouraged every step toward it, yet whenever she reached for something I could not control, fear turned my hands into locked doors. Craig saw that he had struck something true. That does not make you right, I said. No, it makes you human. I took the agreement from the workbench and placed it in my desk drawer. Craig's expression softened with satisfaction. You are reconsidering. I am keeping evidence of the pressure you are applying to a beneficiary through her guardian. The satisfaction vanished. I closed the drawer and held out my hand toward the exit. You can leave now. When I returned home, Callie was at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She had contacted Naomi herself. I asked for everything I have a right to review, she said. The full trust summary, the operating agreement, the appraisal, and all communications about the sale. I set my keys down. That was the right thing to do. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was waiting for me to add instructions. I did not. Naomi also said Mom left a recording, Callie continued. There's a transcript with it. My breath caught. I didn't know. She said it was held until I was close to adulthood and asked for my complete file myself. You never heard it. No. Callie turned the laptop so I could see the electronic request form. Her signature already waited at the bottom. She wants us at her office tomorrow. I have to sign this before she can release it. I sat across from her, but did not reach for the computer. Do you want me there when you listen? Callie's fingers rested over the trackpad. For once, I did not fill the silence while she searched for an answer. I don't know yet, she said. All right. She signed the request. The following afternoon, Naomi placed a speaker between us in the same office where the appraisal had changed everything. Callie had decided I could remain, but she asked me to sit in the chair near the window rather than beside her. Naomi confirmed that Tessa had recorded the message during her final weeks. She had also prepared a transcript in case the audio became damaged. Neither Naomi nor I explained what Callie might hear. Callie touched the brass tag beneath her shirt and nodded. Naomi pressed play. There was a soft rustle, followed by a breath I had not heard in 11 years. Then Tessa's voice filled the room. If you are hearing this, someone has probably found a reason to call you family again. By the time Naomi pressed play, only 10 days remained before Callie's 18th birthday. Tessa's voice came through the speaker thin and tired, but unmistakably hers. The first sentence left Callie staring at the table. If you are hearing this, someone has probably found a reason to call you family again. There was a rustle in the recording, followed by a small laugh. I remembered that laugh. Tessa used it whenever she was afraid and trying to make the fear sound ordinary. Hi, baby, she continued. You are probably not a baby anymore, and you probably hate when people call you that. I'm sorry. I only know the version of you who leaves apple slices under her pillow because she thinks dreams get hungry. Callie covered her mouth. I had forgotten about the apple slices. For months after Daniel died, Tessa had found them beneath Callie's pillow every morning. Callie had been too young to remember clearly, but her mother had carried the detail forward for her. Tessa told her that needing quiet did not make her weak. Taking longer to answer did not mean she did not understand. If people rushed her, she was allowed to ask for time. If someone claimed a decision was urgent, she should ask who benefited from the urgency. Do not sign anything because someone cries, Tessa said. Do not say yes because someone reminds you what they have lost. Their grief is real, but it does not belong on your shoulders. Callie's tears began before Tessa mentioned the orchard. During Tessa's final months, Beverly and Craig had rarely offered to stay with Callie. They had spoken about work, space, therapy costs, and how difficult it would be to change the child's routine. Then, while Tessa was receiving treatment, they came to the hospital with papers concerning Monroe Orchards. Craig wanted her to approve changes that would make refinancing easier. Beverly sat beside the bed and told her that family members sometimes had to sacrifice for the survival of everyone else. I was sick, Tessa said in the recording. I was frightened, and they asked me to protect the orchard before either of them offered to take you to school. Naomi did not move. Callie lowered her hand from her mouth and listened without wiping her face. Tessa explained that Craig was not a monster. He loved the orchard because it was the one thing in his life that never left. Beverly loved her children, but she sometimes confused loving a family with protecting its name. Their feelings could be genuine, while their choices were still wrong. That is what makes this difficult, Tessa said. People do not have to be lying about every feeling to use you. My chest tightened. Then Tessa spoke the sentence she had preserved for a daughter she would never see grow up. Don't give my daughter to people who only call her family when she has something they want. Callie bent forward, pressing both hands over her face. The sound that escaped her was small and broken, nothing like the controlled crying I had heard at the funeral. This was grief arriving 11 years late, because her mother was no longer speaking to a 6-year-old child. She was speaking to the young woman Callie had become. I wanted to move beside her, but she had asked me to sit near the window. I stayed where I was. The recording continued. Angela, if you are there, I know you kept your promise. You always stay when things become inconvenient. That is why I chose you. My eyes closed. But she is not a promise you own. Do not protect her so well that she never gets to choose anything dangerous. Do not answer every question, because you are afraid someone else will give her the wrong answer. When she is old enough, tell her what you know. Tell her what you do not know. Then let her decide. The shame I had felt when Callie found Beverly's letter returned with greater force. Tessa had trusted me because I stayed, but she had also understood exactly how staying could turn into holding too tightly. If Callie chooses people you do not trust, help her see clearly. If she chooses a life that takes her away from you, let her go knowing she can come back. Love should give her a home, not a smaller world. Tessa paused to catch her breath. Callie, you never have to choose between loving me and loving Angela. You never have to prove you belong by giving anyone money, land, forgiveness, or a second chance. Ask questions. Take your time. Let people show you who they are when you tell them no. The recording ended with Tessa saying she loved Callie 3 times, the last one barely audible. No one spoke until Naomi reached over and stopped the empty hiss coming from the speaker. Callie wiped her cheeks with both hands. She knew. She recognized a pattern, Naomi said. That does not mean she knew exactly what would happen 11 years later. Callie looked at me. Did you hear what she said to you? Every word. My mom warned me about them, but she also warned me about you. Yes, she waited for me to defend myself. I had defended every decision for so long that silence probably felt suspicious. I was afraid, I said. Not only that they would use you, I was afraid you would find the family history I could not give you and decide you did not need me anymore. Callie's eyes filled again, but she did not look away. I kept telling myself I was protecting you. Sometimes I was. Sometimes I was protecting my place in your life. That truth feels better than being told everything was for my own good, she said. It does not fix the letter. I know. She touched the speaker. Mom's warning cannot make this decision for me either. The answer hurt and relieved me at the same time. You are right, I said. It cannot. Callie turned to Naomi and requested the complete appraisal, purchase agreement, operating agreement, every amendment, and any analysis of alternatives to selling the entire property. She also wanted all communications between Craig, the trustee, and the prospective buyer that she was legally entitled to review. Naomi sent the request that afternoon. Craig responded the next morning by claiming that some materials contained confidential company information. He said the closing deadline made a broad review impractical and offered to provide a simplified summary instead. Callie refused the summary. Over the following days, Naomi obtained part of the financial package. We reviewed it at my kitchen table, but I made myself wait until Callie asked a question before answering. The debts were real. The equipment loans existed. The line of credit was close to its limit, and the most recent harvest had not produced enough revenue to repair the irrigation system. Callie ran one finger down the figures. What if Mom was right about how they treated people, but Craig is right about what the orchard needs now? Both could be true, I said. That makes it worse. Beverly called that evening. Callie put the phone on speaker by choice. Beverly said she had never known about Tessa's recording. She admitted, refusing to take Callie had been cowardly and cruel, but begged her not to punish employees, relatives, and generations of family history for one terrible decision. You did not make one decision, Callie said. You made it again every year you stayed away. Beverly began to cry. I regret every one of those years. I believe you regret them, Callie replied. I do not know if regret gives you the right to come back. After the call, another set of documents arrived from Naomi. Most were copies we had already seen, but one email chain had been forwarded from the buyer's attorney. Callie read it twice, then enlarged a sentence near the bottom. The buyer was discussing the proposed closing schedule, employee severance, and something called Mr. Monroe's transition consulting agreement. Craig had never mentioned a separate agreement with the buyer. Callie turned the laptop toward me and pointed at the line. What is Craig being paid to make me sign? 3 days before Callie's 18th birthday, Naomi spread the missing documents across her conference table while an independent financial advisor joined us by video. Callie sat closest to the files. I took the chair beside the wall and waited for her to ask me to move nearer. The first document was Craig's transition consulting agreement with the buyer. If the sale of the entire orchard closed before the offer expired, Craig would receive $125,000 for helping transfer operations, records, and vendor relationships. Callie read the amount twice. Is that illegal? Not automatically, Naomi said. A buyer can pay someone for legitimate transition work. The problem is that Craig pushed you and the trustee toward this sale without disclosing that he would personally be paid only if it closed on time. The advisor explained the consequence in simpler terms. The trustee had to decide whether the sale was prudent for Callie's trust, not whether it was good for Craig. A hidden personal reward did not prove the entire offer was bad, but it meant the trustee could no longer rely on Craig's recommendations without an independent review. Callie pressed her thumb against the brass orchard tag. He told me the deadline was about workers and debt. Those concerns are real, Naomi said. They are not the only concerns he had. The next file hurt more because it showed what Craig had not told us. 6 months earlier, an agricultural consultant had proposed selling a section of non-producing land near the highway. The proceeds could pay down the most urgent debt while leaving the productive rows, packing house and water rights with Monroe Orchards. It was not a painless rescue. The orchard would still need refinancing, reduced operating costs, and delayed equipment replacement. Some acreage would be gone permanently, and the family would receive far less money than a full sale. Still, it was a real alternative. A note in Craig's email dismissed the plan because the buyer wanted the entire parcel and would not pay his transition fee for a partial transaction. Callie pushed back from the table. He let me think the only choices were signing or destroying everything. He presented the choice that benefited him most, Naomi said. The trustee now has to determine whether it also benefits the trust. The current offer. Callie asked Naomi to arrange a call with Craig and Beverly that afternoon. She did not ask me to speak for her, and I did not offer. Craig appeared on the screen from the orchard office. Beverly sat beside him with her hands folded over a handkerchief. When Callie asked about the fee, Craig's face hardened. I have kept that business alive for 11 years, he said. The payment compensates me for months of work after closing. Why wasn't it in the information you sent my lawyer? It is a private agreement between me and the buyer. It affects why you want me to consent. Craig looked past the camera as though searching for someone more reasonable. Angela has filled your head with suspicion because she wants to keep controlling the trust. I felt the old urge to interrupt. Callie lifted one finger toward me without looking away from the screen, and I stayed silent. You asked about the trustee before you asked anything about my life, she told him. Angela did not make you do that. Beverly leaned forward. Your uncle has carried that orchard since your mother became ill. $125,000 does not repay what it has taken from him. Then he should have told me, Callie said. Being tired does not make hiding it honest. Craig insisted that the partial land proposal was unrealistic. Naomi asked him to identify the updated analysis proving that claim. He said there had not been time to commission one. There was time to negotiate your consulting agreement, Callie replied. Craig ended the call by demanding a family meeting at the old packing house immediately after her birthday. He said the buyer would attend and warned that every day of delay weakened the orchard's position. Less than an hour later, an email arrived for me. Craig had attached a revised reimbursement agreement. The Monroe family would pay me $186,000 after closing, described as compensation for 11 years of therapy, education, and daily care. In exchange, I would state that the full sale served Callie's best interests and encourage her to sign the informed beneficiary consent. This time, I did not hide the offer in a drawer. I carried my laptop to Callie's room and showed her the email before answering it. She read the amount, then looked toward the workshop visible through her window. That would pay off your business loan. Yes. And the roof. Yes. Are you going to take it? No, but I want you to hear why. I am not refusing it to make you refuse the sale. I am refusing because Craig is trying to turn the years we lived together into leverage over your decision. I forwarded the agreement to Naomi. Then I signed a statement confirming that I sought no repayment from Callie's trust or the Monroe family for the cost of raising her. Naomi added that the statement did not erase Craig's attempt, but it removed any claim that my advice was tied to receiving money from the transaction. Callie watched my signature appear on the screen. You could have asked for help years ago. I could have. They still would not get to buy my opinion now. She closed the laptop carefully. You're giving up a lot of money. I am removing a price, Craig attached to my voice. Your choice still belongs to you. For the rest of that afternoon, Callie prepared for the packing house meeting. She wrote her questions in a notebook and arranged them in the order she wanted answered. The consulting fee came first, followed by the partial land proposal, the orchard debt, employee protections, and the buyer's plans for Tessa's tree. Whenever a question grew too long, she rewrote it. Whenever I started suggesting how Craig might respond, I stopped and asked whether she wanted my opinion. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she said she needed to think alone. She practiced saying, "I have not finished," without apologizing. Then she practiced asking for a document instead of accepting a promise that one existed. Naomi reminded her that she could refuse to sign anything that day, even if every person in the room claimed delay would be disastrous. The night before her birthday, Callie found me repairing a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet. She sat on the counter in Tessa's denim jacket and watched me tighten the final screw. "If I agree to the full sale tomorrow, will you think I chose them?" she asked. I set the screwdriver down. I'll think you made a choice. My job is to make sure it was yours. What if it's the wrong choice? Then it should still be yours to understand, live with, and change, when change is possible. I can tell you what I see. I cannot make your life safe by living it for you. Callie looked down at the brass tag, resting against the jacket. Mom said love should give me a home, not a smaller world. She was right. At midnight, I wished her happy birthday. There were no balloons or large celebration because neither of us wanted the day turned into a countdown clock for strangers. We ate one slice of apple cake at the kitchen table, and Callie opened a small box containing the restored wooden horse from Tessa's bedroom. Beverly had sent it through Naomi with no note, asking for anything in return. The next morning, Callie's phone vibrated while we were gathering the folders for the meeting. Craig's message appeared across the screen. The buyer will be at the packing house at noon. Bring your ID. We can finish this today. Callie read it without answering. She slipped the phone into her pocket, picked up her notebook, and looked at me. Then today they answer my questions first. The old packing house felt colder than the summer air outside. Dusty windows admitted pale sunlight, but the concrete floor held a deep chill. Faded numbers marked the loading bays, and a rusted conveyor crossed the room like a skeleton. Callie stopped beneath a photograph of Tessa and Craig as teenagers, standing beside crates of apples with their sleeves rolled up. Tessa was laughing while Craig watched the scale, one hand on the ledger beside it. A long folding table had been placed where workers once sorted fruit. The purchase agreement waited in the center beside a pen, copies of the appraisal and a stack of signature pages. Beverly sat at one end. Craig stood behind her, and Naomi sat beside Callie. The trustee and buyer representatives faced us. Craig began before everyone had settled. We all know why we are here. The orchard cannot carry another season of debt. The buyer is prepared to protect the workers through closing, pay every secured loan, and preserve the Monroe name in the new development. We should sign today and stop creating unnecessary risk. Callie placed her notebook on the table. I have questions first. The answers are in the documents, Craig said. Your lawyer has had them for days. Then answering should be easy. Why are you receiving $125,000 if this sale closes on time? Beverly looked down. Craig's eyes moved toward the buyer's representative. That agreement concerns transition work after closing, he said. Vendor contracts, equipment inventories, employment records, and operational knowledge. It is separate from your trust. It is separate from my trust, but not from why you kept telling me there was no time. You do not understand how much work I have done to keep this place alive. That is not an answer to why you hid it. Craig drew a breath through his nose. I did not hide anything. It was a private agreement that did not change the value paid for the land. Naomi turned one page toward the trustee's representative. It changes the manager's personal incentive and should have been disclosed during the fiduciary review. Craig ignored her. Callie, every hour we spend arguing weakens the deal. Sign the consent, and the trustee can move forward. Callie did not touch the pen. Why did you reject the proposal to sell the non-producing acreage near the highway? It was not viable. The consultant said it could pay the urgent debt. It would not solve the long-term problems. It would leave us with old equipment, expensive water access, and too little capital to replant. Did you ask for an updated analysis? There was no time. The buyer's representative shifted in his chair. For clarity, the partial sale was discussed during preliminary negotiations. Mr. Monroe rejected it because our company wanted control of the full parcel. Craig turned toward him. That is an incomplete description. The representative continued carefully. It also would not have activated the transition consulting agreement under its current terms. The silence changed the room. Beverly reached for Callie's hand. Callie moved her notebook between them, before their fingers touched. Your uncle has worked himself sick for this family, Beverly said. He made one arrangement to protect himself after giving everything to the orchard. Angela has convinced you that every mistake is proof we do not love you. Callie's face remained still. Angela did not write the consulting agreement. She has spent 11 years keeping you away from us. She has filled your life with her version of what happened. Beverly turned toward me. You are not her mother. You have no right to keep her from her real family. Every instinct in me rose to answer. I could have repeated the funeral words and listed every birthday, therapy appointment, and frightened night they had missed. Instead, I looked at Callie. Your grandmother is right about one thing, I said. I did keep information from you. Beverly's expression changed with surprise. I hid her letter because I was afraid, I continued. I told myself I was protecting you, but I took away your choice. That was wrong. I opened my folder and placed Craig's reimbursement agreement on the table. The amount of $186,000 was printed near the bottom, followed by the condition that I support the full sale. Craig's face darkened. That was an attempt to recognize what you spent. I did not raise her on credit. I placed every copy I carried in front of Callie, including the old trust notices, the appraisal, the hidden alternative, and the agreement Craig had sent me. Then I moved my chair away from hers and stood near the wall. Do not speak through me anymore, I said. Do not ask me to persuade her. Answer Callie. Craig finally looked uncertain. Callie opened her notebook. Who decided the full sale was the only option? The management team and our advisors, Craig replied. Which advisors? He named the firm that prepared the partial sale proposal. The same advisor you ignored? We evaluated it. Where is that evaluation? Craig glanced at the clock mounted above the old conveyor. We do not have time to conduct a trial over every email. The buyer is here. The trustee is here. You are 18 now. You don't need to understand every page. You only need to sign where your mother should have signed 11 years ago. The words struck harder than any fist against my door. Beverly whispered his name, but Craig kept going. Tessa made every orchard decision personal. She delayed refinancing when the business needed certainty, and now her trust is doing the same thing. The trustee's representative closed the folder in front of her. Mr. Monroe, did you ask Tessa to approve financial changes while she was receiving cancer treatment? Craig's mouth tightened. That has nothing to do with today. It relates directly to the history of pressure surrounding this ownership interest, your undisclosed compensation, and the completeness of the information provided to the trustee. The buyer's representative removed the pen from beside the agreement. Without valid member approval and a completed fiduciary process, our company cannot close today. Craig pointed toward me. This is what she wanted. Angela has turned Callie against the only family she has left. Stop talking about me as if I'm not here, Callie said. Craig faced her. She stood slowly, one hand resting on her notebook and the other around the brass tag beneath her shirt. You called me a burden when I needed help. Now you call me family because you need mine. That isn't family. It's a transaction. Beverly's eyes filled. You are still my blood. Blood tells me where I began. It does not give you ownership of where I go. Callie turned toward the trustee's representative. Her voice shook, but she did not hurry. I will not sign informed beneficiary consent for this sale. I want an independent valuation, a full review of Craig's conflict of interest, and a serious analysis of the partial land option. I also want every future communication about the transaction sent through Naomi. No private visits, no late-night calls, and no documents brought to my home. The representative nodded. Those are reasonable requests. The trustee will begin its own review. Your refusal means the current full sale proposal cannot receive the consent required under the trust. I am not saying the orchard can never be sold, Callie said. I am saying no one gets my consent by hiding the choices from me. Craig gripped the back of Beverly's chair. If you delay this, the orchard may not survive until spring. Callie looked around the packing house, at the old conveyor, Tessa's photograph, and the unsigned contract. Then we will find out whether you are trying to save the orchard or sell it to save yourself. The trustee's representative closed the signature pages inside her folder and formally suspended consideration until the fiduciary review ended. The buyer's representative gathered his papers without arguing. Craig remained standing in the middle of the packing house, surrounded by the place he had controlled for years and unable to force the one decision he needed. Outside, Callie stopped beside me but did not reach for my hand. She did not need me to lead her away this time. Naomi joined us at the door and spoke quietly enough that Beverly and Craig could not hear. Stopping the sale was the easy part. Now you have to decide what saving the orchard actually costs. The orchard did not collapse the morning after Callie refused to sign. That was the first thing the review proved. The second was that Craig had told the truth about the debt, but not the whole truth about the choices. For several weeks, the trustees' advisors examined loan records, operating expenses, water rights, and the buyer's offer. They found no stolen money, forged documents, or criminal scheme. They found an orchard weakened by poor harvests, old equipment, and years of decisions made by one man who had stopped believing anyone should question him. Craig's hidden consulting fee mattered because it showed where his judgment had divided. He might have wanted to save Monroe Orchards, but he also wanted the transaction that paid him personally. By withholding the partial sale proposal, he had prevented the trustee and the other members from comparing every reasonable option. The lender refused to participate in restructuring, while Craig remained in control. The other family members agreed that he had to step down as manager until a new operating plan was approved. He did not go to jail. He did not lose every dollar he owned. He lost the position that had allowed him to speak as though the orchard and the family were the same thing. The buyer canceled his $125,000 consulting agreement. When Naomi explained the outcome, Callie did not smile. "He really did work there his whole life," she said. "He did," Naomi replied. "And he still lied to me." "Yes." Callie looked down at the brass tag resting against her sweater. "Both things keep being true." That had become one of the hardest lessons of her 18th year. Craig could love the orchard and still use her. Beverly could regret abandoning her and still expect forgiveness too quickly. I could stay for 11 years and still hurt Callie by deciding what she was allowed to know. Love did not erase harm. Harm did not make every past feeling false. The independent advisors eventually proposed selling 40 acres of non-producing land near the highway. The sale would cover the most urgent debt and fund essential irrigation repairs. The productive orchard, packing house, and Tessa's tree would remain. The plan required sacrifices. Monroe Orchards would operate with fewer employees during the next season. Equipment purchases would be delayed, and the remaining owners would receive no distributions while the new loan was repaid. There was no guarantee that one good year would solve everything. Callie reviewed the proposal with Naomi and her own financial advisor. She asked questions until the answers stopped sounding rehearsed. When the trustee asked whether she would provide informed consent for the partial sale, Callie did not look at me before answering. "Yes," she said. "For the 40 acres described in the independent report. Not for the entire orchard." Her consent did not command the trustee to act. It allowed the trustee to complete its own review and approve the limited transaction after determining that it protected the trust better than foreclosure or the original full sale. Callie's share of the proceeds remained inside the trust. The money was allocated for education, future housing, and long-term support under Tessa's plan. There was no new car in our driveway. Callie still worked afternoons at the library and compared textbook prices before registering for classes. Her decision surprised people who had assumed she wanted revenge. She had stopped Craig's sale because he had hidden information and pressured her. Once she received an honest choice, she helped preserve the part of the orchard that could still survive. "I didn't save it for them," she told me. "I saved what Mom protected for me. That includes the right not to destroy it just because they hurt me." A month after the review ended, Beverly sent another letter through Naomi. There were no photographs inside, and no invitation to the farmhouse. She did not mention blood, forgiveness, or how much time she had left. She wrote that abandoning Callie had been her choice, not an accident caused by grief. She acknowledged that returning only after the appraisal made every apology look like another attempt to gain something. At the bottom, She wrote that she would answer any question Callie asked, but she would not contact her again unless Callie chose it. Naomi gave the letter to Callie in a sealed envelope. Callie held it for several minutes, then handed it back. "Keep it in my file." "You don't want to read it?" I asked. "Not yet." I almost told her she might regret waiting. Instead, I asked, "Do you want me to say anything?" "No. I just want you to understand that not reading it is my choice too." "I understand." She looked at me carefully. "You're learning." The damage between us did not disappear because I admitted I had been wrong. For weeks, Callie questioned small decisions that once would have passed unnoticed. She asked why I had declined an overnight school trip when she was 15. She asked why I had answered for her during appointments. She asked whether I had ever mistaken her anxiety for inability. Sometimes my answers disappointed her. Sometimes I could not remember when a habit had begun. I did not ask her to forgive me each time. I listened until she was finished. I also began asking before helping. When college acceptance letters arrived, I waited for Callie to open them. When she struggled with housing forms, I asked whether she wanted advice or company. When she chose a program 2 hours away, instead of Briar Glen Community College, fear tightened around my ribs, but I did not tell her she was not ready. "Do you think I can do it?" she asked. "I think you will have difficult days." "That isn't what I asked." I smiled despite the ache in my chest. "Yes, I think you can do it." She sat beside me on the couch, leaving a few inches between us. "You know, staying for 11 years doesn't mean you own me." "I know. It doesn't mean you get to make every decision." "I know that too." She rested her head against my shoulder. "But it gives me 11 years of reasons to keep choosing you." I closed my eyes. That was more than ownership could ever have given me. By early spring, the partial sale had closed, and the orchard's urgent debts had been paid. A new manager took over daily operations. Craig remained an owner, but all financial communication involving Callie's trust went through the trustee. He was not permitted to contact her privately about money or business decisions. Beverly kept her distance. Callie did not forgive her, but she stopped saying she never would. She allowed the future to remain undecided, which was not the same as offering it freely. One cold Saturday in March, we returned to Monroe Orchards with the new manager's permission. The rows were bare except for small buds beginning to form along the branches. Tessa's tree had survived another winter. A horticulturist cut a healthy piece from one of its younger branches and wrapped it carefully for transport. Callie held it across her palms as though it were fragile, though he assured us apple wood was stronger than it looked. We carried the graft home and planted a young rootstock in the sunniest part of our yard. I held the stem steady, while Callie fitted Tessa's cutting into the prepared notch. She wrapped the joining point with a strip of grafting tape, checking the alignment twice before tying it securely. The old brass orchard tag hung from a cord around her neck. Before we finished, she took a new copper tag from her pocket. She had stamped 2 dates into it. The first was the day Tessa planted the original tree. The second was that morning. Callie attached the new tag to the young trunk. A light wind lifted both pieces of metal until the old tag touched the new one with a soft, clear sound. "Hold it a little longer," she said. I kept my hand around the stem until she finished securing the final knot. Then I let go. The tree remained upright. Callie filled the watering can and poured slowly around the roots. She did not ask whether the tree belonged to Tessa, to the Monroes, or to us. It carried something from where she began, but it was growing in the place she had chosen. I stood beside her without reaching for the can or telling her how much water to use. When she finished, she set it down and slipped her hand into mine. We stayed there until the wind stopped moving the tags.